Introduction. Ethics, the study of what is right and wrong, has been central to human philosophy for thousands of years. Western ethics, in particular, has traveled a long and fascinating journey, shaped by thinkers whose ideas still influence us today. In this video, we'll explore the evolution of ethical thought in Western philosophy, from the early debates in ancient Greece to the complex moral questions of the modern world. We'll look at how philosophers like Socrates, Aristotle, and Kant wrestled with questions of virtue, justice, and moral duty, shaping the way we think about right and wrong. So let's begin with the dawn of ethical thought in ancient Greece. Our journey starts in ancient Greece, the birthplace of Western philosophy, where ethical thought emerged as a central concern. Socrates was one of the first philosophers to raise profound moral questions, and he believed that true wisdom begins with self-knowledge. For Socrates, a good life was one in which a person continuously examined their beliefs and actions. His method of questioning, now known as the Socratic method, challenged people to think deeply about their moral values. As Socrates once said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." His student, Plato, took these ideas further. In his famous work, The Republic, Plato explored the concept of justice and the role of ethics in governing society. Plato believed that true knowledge came from understanding the world of forms, ideal, eternal concepts like justice, truth, and goodness. One of Plato's most well-known metaphors is the allegory of the cave, where he imagined humans as prisoners watching shadows on a wall, mistaking those shadows for reality. True ethical knowledge, Plato argued, comes from turning away from these shadows and seeking the truth beyond them. Aristotle, Plato's most famous student, took a more practical approach. He argued that ethics is not about abstract ideals, but about how to live a virtuous life in the real world. In his work, Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle introduced the concept of the golden mean, the idea that virtue lies between two extremes. For example, courage is the balance between recklessness and cowardice. For Aristotle, the goal of ethics was eudaimonia, human flourishing. This was achieved by living a life of virtue, in harmony with reason, and fulfilling one's potential. As Greek philosophy spread throughout the Roman Empire, it influenced the ethical views of Roman thinkers. One of the most significant schools of thought that emerged during this time was Stoicism. Stoicism taught that virtue is the only true good, and that we should live in accordance with nature and reason. Stoic philosophers like Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius emphasized the importance of self-control and rationality. They believed that external events are beyond our control, but our reactions to those events are within our power. Marcus Aurelius, in his work Meditations, wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." As the Roman Empire transitioned to Christianity, the moral teachings of Jesus began to intertwine with classical philosophy. Christian ethics, heavily influenced by St. Augustine, introduced new ideas about divine law and human nature. St. Augustine believed that true morality could only be achieved through faith in God. He emphasized the role of free will in human action, but also the consequences of original sin. Augustine argued that without divine grace, humans would be powerless to overcome their sinful nature. His work, The City of God, laid the foundation for Christian thought in the medieval world, combining elements of Greek philosophy with Christian theology. Augustine's view of ethics placed less focus on earthly success and more on the spiritual salvation of the soul. Medieval period. During the Middle Ages, Western ethics became closely linked with religious thought, as scholars tried to reconcile faith with reason. One of the most influential figures of this time was St. Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas developed the natural law theory, which argued that the moral law is written into the very nature of human beings. He believed that through reason, humans can discover the ethical principles that lead to the common good, and that these principles reflect God's divine plan. Aquinas's work, particularly in Summa Theologica, blended Aristotle's philosophy with Christian teachings. For Aquinas, living an ethical life meant fulfilling God's purpose by using reason to discern what is morally right and wrong. At the same time, medieval scholars developed scholasticism, a method of learning that emphasized critical reasoning. Scholastics sought to explain how religious faith could be supported by philosophical argument, creating a unique blend of theology and ethics that dominated European thought for centuries. Enlightenment ethics. Ethical thought underwent a major transformation during the Enlightenment, a period marked by reason, science, and individual freedom. Philosophers began to question traditional authority, including religious doctrines, and instead sought to ground morality in human reason. One of the most influential Enlightenment philosophers was Immanuel Kant, who developed a new approach to ethics called deontology. Kant believed that morality is based on duty, and that actions are morally right if they are done out of a sense of obligation, regardless of the consequences. Kant's most famous concept, the categorical imperative, states that we should act according to principles that we would want everyone to follow universally. In other words, we should treat others as ends in themselves, not as means to an end. As Kant wrote, act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. At the same time, David Hume offered a different perspective on ethics. Hume argued that human emotions, rather than reason, are the foundation of morality. He believed that our moral decisions are guided by feelings of sympathy, compassion, and approval, rather than by strict rational principles. Hume's ideas paved the way for utilitarianism, a theory later popularized by John Stuart Mill. Mill's utilitarianism argued that the best action is the one that maximizes happiness for the greatest number of people. This approach to ethics focuses on the consequences of actions rather than the intentions behind them. Modern and contemporary ethics. As we move into the modern era, ethics took on new forms, shaped by challenges to traditional morality and the rise of individualism. One of the most influential and controversial figures in modern ethics was Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche rejected the moral values of Christianity and traditional philosophy, arguing that they represented a slave morality, a set of values designed to suppress human potential. He believed that individuals should create their own values and live according to their own will, free from the constraints of societal norms. In his work Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche introduced the idea of the Übermensch, or Overman, a person who transcends conventional morality to create their own meaning and purpose in life. Nietzsche famously declared, "God is dead," a statement not meant to be taken literally, but as a critique of the decline of traditional religious and moral values in modern society. Nietzsche's radical ideas laid the groundwork for existentialist ethics, which focused on personal freedom and responsibility. One of the leading existentialist thinkers, Jean-Paul Sartre, argued that humans are condemned to be free. According to Sartre, there is no preordained essence or purpose to human life, so individuals must create their own moral values through their actions. Sartre's famous line, "Existence precedes essence," encapsulates this idea: we exist first, and only through our choices do we define who we are. With this radical freedom comes immense responsibility, as each person must take ownership of their actions without relying on external moral codes. Modern and contemporary ethics. As we move into the modern era, ethics took on new forms, shaped by challenges to traditional morality and the rise of individualism. One of the most influential and controversial figures in modern ethics was Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche rejected the moral values of Christianity and traditional philosophy, arguing that they represented a slave morality, a set of values designed to suppress human potential. He believed that individuals should create their own values and live according to their own will, free from the constraints of societal norms. In his work Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche introduced the idea of the Übermensch, or Overman, a person who transcends conventional morality to create their own meaning and purpose in life. Nietzsche famously declared, "God is dead," a statement not meant to be taken literally, but as a critique of the decline of traditional religious and moral values in modern society. Nietzsche's radical ideas laid the groundwork for existentialist ethics, which focused on personal freedom and responsibility. One of the leading existentialist thinkers, Jean-Paul Sartre, argued that humans are condemned to be free. According to Sartre, there is no preordained essence or purpose to human life, so individuals must create their own moral values through their actions. Sartre's famous line, "Existence precedes essence," encapsulates this idea: we exist first, and only through our choices do we define who we are. With this radical freedom comes immense responsibility, as each person must take ownership of their actions without relying on external moral codes. As we have seen, Western ethics has evolved over thousands of years, shaped by philosophers who have grappled with the deepest questions of morality. From the virtue-based ethics of Aristotle to the duty-based ethics of Kant, from the utilitarianism of Mill to the existentialism of Sartre, each of these thinkers has contributed to our understanding of what it means to live a good and moral life. Today, we face new ethical challenges that require us to continue this conversation. What is the role of technology in our lives? How should we respond to global issues like inequality and climate change? These questions will shape the future of ethics, just as the great philosophers of the past shaped its history. As you reflect on the ideas we've explored, ask yourself, what ethical framework resonates most with you? How do you approach moral decisions in your own life? The journey of ethics continues, and each of us has a role to play. Here's a sequence of ethics-related quotes, starting from older sources and working our way to more contemporary thinkers. I'll state each quote and then provide a brief explanation and elaboration. 1. Socrates quote: "The unexamined life is not worth living." Elaboration: Socrates believed that self-reflection and critical thinking are essential for a moral life. This quote emphasizes the importance of continuously questioning and evaluating our beliefs, actions, and values. For Socrates, living ethically requires us to understand the reasons behind our actions and to seek wisdom in knowing what is truly good. His method of engaging others in dialogue, often referred to as the Socratic method, was designed to help people uncover deeper truths about themselves and their moral beliefs. 2. Aristotle quote: "Virtue lies in our power, and similarly so does vice. Where it is in our power to act, it is also in our power not to act." Elaboration: in this quote, Aristotle points to the idea of moral responsibility and the freedom of choice. He believed that virtue is a habit developed through deliberate choices and actions. Aristotle's concept of the golden mean, the balance between excess and deficiency, emphasizes that ethical living involves making choices that avoid extremes. We are responsible for cultivating good habits and character traits through the choices we make in everyday life. 3. Marcus Aurelius quote: "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Elaboration: as a Stoic philosopher, Marcus Aurelius emphasized the importance of controlling one's internal reactions rather than trying to control the external world. In ethics, this idea highlights the role of self-discipline and inner virtue in achieving a moral life. Stoics believed that while we cannot control what happens to us, we can control how we respond, and that virtue comes from remaining rational and calm in the face of adversity. 4. St. Augustine quote: "Right is right even if no one is doing it, wrong is wrong even if everyone is doing it." Elaboration: St. Augustine's quote reflects his belief in the objective nature of moral truth. He argued that ethics should not be based on popular opinion or societal trends, but rather on eternal truths grounded in God's will. Augustine believed that morality is about adhering to these absolute truths, regardless of what others think or do. This idea became central to Christian ethics, emphasizing the role of divine law in determining what is morally right. 5. Immanuel Kant quote: "Act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law." Elaboration. This quote is a key principle of Kant's categorical imperative, which is central to his deontological approach to ethics. Kant argued that moral actions must be based on rules that can be applied universally, without exception. For example, if lying is wrong, it must be wrong in all situations, for everyone. Kant believed that true morality is based on duty and rationality, and that we should treat others as ends in themselves, never as mere means to an end. 6. John Stuart Mill quote, actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. Elaboration. This quote comes from Mill's utilitarianism, a consequentialist ethical theory. Mill argues that the moral value of an action is determined by its outcome, specifically, whether it promotes the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. This approach to ethics emphasizes practical consequences and seeks to maximize overall well-being. Mill expanded on Bentham's utilitarianism by including the idea that some pleasures are more valuable than others, suggesting that intellectual and moral pleasures are superior to physical ones. 7. Friedrich Nietzsche quote, you have your way. I have my way. As for the right way, it does not exist. Elaboration. Nietzsche's quote reflects his moral relativism and rejection of absolute moral values. He believed that traditional moral systems, particularly those rooted in religion, were constructs designed to suppress human potential. For Nietzsche, individuals should create their own values based on their personal strengths and desires. His philosophy challenges the idea of universal morality, advocating instead for the Übermensch, a person who creates their own meaning in life and lives beyond the constraints of conventional morality. 8. Jean-Paul Sartre quote, man is condemned to be free, because once thrown into the world, he is responsible for everything he does. Elaboration. Sartre's existentialist view emphasizes radical freedom and the heavy responsibility that comes with it. According to Sartre, humans have no preordained purpose, so we must create meaning and values through our actions. This freedom can be overwhelming because it means that individuals are entirely responsible for defining their own morality without relying on external sources. Ethical living, in Sartre's view, is about authentically embracing this freedom and the responsibility it entails. 9. Elizabeth Anscombe quote, the concepts of obligation and duty, moral obligation and moral duty, that is to say, and of what is morally right and wrong, and of the moral sense of ought to be jettisoned if this is psychologically possible. Elaboration. In this quote, Anscombe critiques modern moral philosophy and its reliance on concepts like duty and obligation, particularly those derived from Kantian ethics. She argues that these concepts are meaningless without a foundation in divine law or an ethical system that gives them substance. Her work played a significant role in the revival of virtue ethics, where morality is seen more as a matter of character and living well rather than following strict rules or obligations. 10. Alasdair MacIntyre quote, the most striking feature of contemporary moral utterance is that so much of it is used to express disagreements, and the most striking feature of those disagreements is their apparent intractability. Elaboration. MacIntyre's quote points to the fragmentation of moral discourse in modern society. He believes that contemporary ethical discussions are often marked by disagreement because they lack a shared framework or common narrative. In his book After Virtue, MacIntyre argues that the Enlightenment project of grounding ethics in reason has failed, and he calls for a return to an ethics of virtue rooted in communities and shared traditions. His work has been influential in the field of virtue ethics and critiques of modern moral relativism. How the law of the state affects ethics. The relationship between law and ethics is complex and intertwined, as both aim to guide human behavior and create a harmonious society. However, while ethics is based on personal or collective moral principles about what is right or wrong, the law is a system of rules enforced by the state to regulate behavior. Let's explore the ways in which the law of the state affects ethics. 1. Law as a reflection of societal ethics. Laws often reflect the ethical values of a society, serving as a codified version of moral principles. For example, laws against theft, murder, and fraud align with ethical standards that condemn dishonesty and harm to others. In this sense, the legal system helps enforce ethical behavior by providing consequences for actions that society deems morally wrong. However, while laws are influenced by ethics, they do not always align perfectly with every individual's ethical beliefs. For instance, a society may legalize practices that certain groups find ethically objectionable, such as the death penalty or abortion. This demonstrates that while laws may be shaped by prevailing ethical norms, they can also be a source of moral conflict. 2. Ethics influencing lawmaking. Ethical debates often play a crucial role in shaping legislation. Lawmakers frequently grapple with moral questions when drafting or amending laws, particularly on contentious issues such as civil rights, healthcare, and criminal justice. Consider the ethical arguments that inform the creation of laws around slavery and civil rights. Over time, societies have deemed the practice of slavery and racial discrimination as morally wrong, leading to legal reforms such as the abolition of slavery and the Civil Rights Act. Environmental protection. Ethical concerns about the well-being of future generations and the health of the planet have influenced laws designed to protect the environment. Healthcare and euthanasia. Ethical debates about the value of life and personal autonomy continue to shape laws regarding euthanasia and end-of-life care, often varying significantly between states and countries. In such cases, ethics serves as a foundational guide for the legal process, pushing societies to adapt their laws to changing moral values and societal progress. 3. Law as an enforcer of ethics. One way the law affects ethics is by creating an enforcement mechanism for moral principles. Laws provide sanctions and penalties for behaviors that violate societal norms. This coercive power of the state can encourage ethical behavior, as individuals may act in morally acceptable ways to avoid legal punishment, even if they do not personally agree with the ethical reasons behind the law. For example, taxation laws. Many people pay taxes because it is legally required, even if they personally object to the tax system or do not see it as a moral obligation. The law enforces the ethical principle of contributing to the common good, but the motivation for compliance is often fear of legal penalties rather than a sense of duty. Anti-discrimination laws. Laws prohibiting discrimination in the workplace help promote ethical principles of equality and fairness. Even if individuals hold prejudiced views, the law can force them to act ethically in professional contexts by protecting the rights of minority groups. In these cases, the law serves as a tool to ensure ethical behavior in society, even for those who may not subscribe to the ethical principles underlying the laws. 4. Conflicts between law and ethics. While laws often aim to embody ethical principles, there are situations where the law conflicts with an individual's or group's ethical beliefs. In such cases, people may find themselves in ethical dilemmas, forced to choose between obeying the law and following their moral convictions. Some examples include civil disobedience. When people believe that a law is unjust, they may engage in acts of civil disobedience, violating the law for ethical reasons. Famous examples include Martin Luther King Jr.'s fight for racial equality in the U.S. or Mahatma Gandhi's peaceful protests against colonial rule in India. In these cases, individuals or groups break the law because they believe it conflicts with higher moral principles. Whistleblowing. Employees who expose illegal or unethical practices within an organization may break confidentiality laws to act in accordance with their ethical beliefs. While whistleblowers often face legal consequences, they argue that their actions are ethically justified by the need to prevent harm or wrongdoing. Conscientious objection. Some individuals may refuse to comply with laws that conflict with their ethical or religious beliefs, such as refusing to perform military service or opposing certain medical procedures. These actions highlight the tension between personal ethics and the legal obligations imposed by the state. In these scenarios, individuals may feel morally compelled to challenge the law, leading to important ethical debates about justice, authority, and individual rights. 5. Ethical limits of the law. Although the law is designed to regulate behavior, there are limits to what it can and should control. Not every ethical issue can or should be addressed by legal means. For example, private morality. Laws generally do not regulate private thoughts or personal moral beliefs, focusing instead on public behavior. Ethical decisions that do not directly harm others, such as personal lifestyle choices, are often left to individual discretion rather than legal enforcement. Virtue and intent. While the law punishes actions, ethics also concerns itself with a person's character and intentions. Someone may follow the law to avoid punishment but still act unethically in other aspects of their life. Legal compliance does not necessarily equate to ethical virtue, as someone may outwardly follow laws while engaging in morally questionable behavior behind the scenes. The law, therefore, has limitations in shaping ethical behavior. It can regulate outward actions, but it cannot force individuals to cultivate virtue or act with genuine moral integrity. Conclusion: the law of the state plays a significant role in shaping and enforcing ethical behavior, reflecting societal norms and guiding actions through the power of the state. However, the relationship between law and ethics is not always straightforward. While laws are often based on ethical principles, they do not always align with individual moral beliefs, and the law can sometimes lag behind ethical progress. Moreover, there are ethical dimensions that fall outside the reach of the law, reminding us that morality is not solely determined by legal standards but also by individual conscience and the pursuit of virtue. International laws and the United Nations, the highest form of ethics and rights. International law, particularly as governed and sanctioned by the United Nations, represents one of the highest forms of ethical ideals and human rights protections in the modern world. These laws and frameworks are designed not only to maintain peace and cooperation among nations but also to uphold universal principles of justice, dignity, and respect for all human beings. By seeking to transcend national interests, international law reflects a collective moral aspiration to protect human rights on a global scale. Here's how international laws approved by the UN embody the pinnacle of ethics and human rights. 1. Universal principles of human dignity and justice at the heart of UN approved. International laws are fundamental principles aimed at protecting human dignity and promoting justice. This is perhaps best exemplified in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948. The UDHR establishes universal human rights standards for all people, regardless of nationality, race, gender, or religion. Its key principles, such as the right to life, liberty, and security, are grounded in the highest ethical ideals of equality and inherent human dignity. The UDHR and subsequent international human rights treaties, such as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, embody ethical values shared across diverse cultures and traditions. These documents reflect the moral consensus that certain rights are inalienable and that every person deserves protection from oppression, violence, and discrimination. By adopting these universal standards, international laws reinforce the idea that ethics should transcend borders and cultures, aiming to establish a common moral foundation for all humanity. 2. Ethics of global cooperation and peace. One of the most ethical dimensions of international law is its focus on promoting global cooperation and preventing conflict. The United Nations itself was founded in 1945 with the explicit purpose of maintaining peace and security, preventing the horrors of war, and fostering peaceful relationships among nations. This reflects an ethical commitment to the well-being of the global community, as opposed to a narrow focus on national interests. International laws that aim to prevent war, such as the UN Charter, embody the ethical principles of non-aggression and diplomacy. The Geneva Conventions, which set standards for humanitarian treatment in times of war, further demonstrate the importance of protecting human life and dignity, even in the most extreme circumstances. These laws are not just legal agreements, they represent moral ideals about how nations should behave toward one another and how individuals caught in conflicts should be treated. By promoting peaceful resolutions to disputes, banning the use of force, and advocating for disarmament, international law reinforces the ethical ideal that peace, rather than violence, is the foundation of a just and harmonious world order. 3. The ethics of protecting vulnerable populations. One of the hallmarks of international law is its emphasis on protecting the most vulnerable populations, a key ethical principle. Whether through treaties on refugees, children's rights, or the elimination of discrimination against women, the UN has consistently advocated for the protection of individuals who are at greater risk of exploitation, marginalization, and violence. For example, the 1951 Refugee Convention outlines the rights of individuals who have fled their home countries due to persecution and guarantees their right to seek asylum. The Convention on the Rights of the Child emphasizes the moral responsibility to protect children from harm, exploitation, and abuse, recognizing that children require special care and attention for their well-being and development. The Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women reflects the ethical imperative to promote gender equality and protect women's rights across cultural and societal boundaries. By addressing the needs of vulnerable populations, these international laws demonstrate a commitment to the ethical principles of compassion, justice, and equality. They reflect the highest ethical aspirations of humanity by ensuring that even the most marginalized individuals are granted fundamental protections and rights. 4. Ethical accountability for crimes against humanity. International law, particularly as developed by the UN, represents a commitment to justice and accountability on a global scale. The creation of institutions like the International Criminal Court is a powerful example of how international laws seek to address and punish crimes that violate basic human dignity, such as genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The Nuremberg trials after World War II and the establishment of the ICC demonstrate the ethical principle that no individual, regardless of their position of power, is above the law. These institutions hold perpetrators of mass atrocities accountable and provide justice for victims, reinforcing the idea that certain crimes are so egregious that they demand international condemnation and legal action. This emphasis on justice reflects one of the highest forms of ethics, ensuring that those who violate the basic rights and dignity of others are held accountable, regardless of borders or political power. By establishing a framework for addressing gross human rights violations, international law reinforces the idea that justice and moral responsibility are universal. 5. Environmental ethics and global responsibility. In recent decades, international law has increasingly recognized the ethical responsibility to protect the planet for future generations. UN-approved frameworks like the Paris Agreement and various environmental conventions reflect the ethical principle of stewardship, emphasizing that humans have a duty to preserve the environment for the global community and future generations. These international agreements focus on addressing global challenges like climate change, biodiversity loss, and environmental degradation. By fostering cooperation among nations to reduce emissions, protect endangered species, and manage natural resources sustainably, these laws reinforce the ethical idea that we share a collective responsibility for the health of the Earth. Environmental law at the international level reflects the highest form of ethics in its acknowledgement that the well-being of humanity is inextricably linked to the well-being of the planet. It promotes a moral duty to act in the interest of the global commons, recognizing that environmental harm in one part of the world can have ripple effects across borders. 6. Promoting human rights over national interests. One of the defining ethical features of international law is that it seeks to prioritize human rights and global well-being over narrow national interests. For instance, international human rights treaties, trade agreements, and peace accords are designed to ensure that ethical principles like equality, fairness, and human dignity take precedence over economic or political power struggles. This is particularly evident in the UN's role in peacekeeping missions, humanitarian interventions, and international diplomacy. The organization's efforts to mediate conflicts and provide aid in crisis situations reflect an ethical commitment to the protection of life, even when national interests are at stake. The UN's peacekeeping operations, for example, are guided by the principle of responsibility to protect, which holds that the international community has a moral duty to intervene when states fail to protect their populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, or crimes against humanity. This idea of global solidarity, the notion that the world's nations should act together to uphold human rights, represents one of the highest ethical ideals in international law. Conclusion: international laws, especially those approved and overseen by the UN, represent some of the highest forms of ethics and rights in the modern world. These laws transcend national borders to promote universal principles of human dignity, justice, equality, and peace. They embody ethical ideals by holding nations accountable for the well-being of their citizens and by providing protections for vulnerable populations and the environment. Ultimately, UN-sanctioned international laws demonstrate a collective moral commitment to creating a just and compassionate global society, one where human rights and ethical responsibilities take precedence over individual interests or national power.